So Dragon's Dogma 2 came out back in March, but it has been far too expensive for me to even remotely consider picking it up, after having played, of course, Dragon's Dogma Dark Arisen. And given everything that I had been seeing and hearing about the game, particularly with regards to how poorly it runs on PC, I was very leery about picking it up in the first place and decided to wait until it was on sale for really, really cheap before I even consider picking it up. Interestingly enough, though, Capcom recently put the game on sale. It was still way too expensive for me to consider picking it up. But during this sale, they also made the game available on a trial basis for anybody to try out for free for up to 2 hours. Once you played 2 hours of it, the game would close and you would not be able to play it anymore until you bought the full version. Now, while it's certainly admirable that they made a trial version at all, 2 hours is really not enough to get a full grasp of what Dragon's Dogma 2 is and whether or not you'd actually want to purchase it for the long haul. After all, as fans of the original game will tell you, the game apparently doesn't get good until you're at least 50 plus hours in and have already actually finished the game and are in what they call post-game. Now that sounds so utterly ridiculous you might think I'm joking about it, but no, I'm not joking. That is what Dragon's Dogma fans will tell you, that the game doesn't actually get truly good until post-game, until you've already completed the entire main story and had to put up with 40 to 50 plus hours of absolute drudgery to get to the so-called good stuff. Obviously, that is a completely absurd notion, one that I have thoroughly debunked in both my video on this game gets good after X number of hours or playthroughs, as well as my video on Dragon's Dogma Dark Arisen itself, and I'll go ahead and throw up links to those in the cards that pop up on the screen, and as well as the video description box if you're interested in taking a look at those. But 2 hours is certainly far too few to really get a full grasp on what this game brings to the table. You really need at least 5 or 6 hours, probably more than that, to really get everything down, be able to delve into some of the more advanced vocations, things like that. So, what does 2 hours of Dragon's Dogma 2 actually get you? Well, unfortunately the answer to that is, it depends. The first thing it depends on is whether you use the external character creation utility in order to go ahead and set up your main character and your main pawn before you actually delve into the game proper. That doesn't count against your 2 hours because that's a separate utility and it is available for free regardless of whether you have the game or not. And since there's quite a lot of character customization options available, it'll probably take you a while to really get the main character and the main pawn all sorted out. So if you went in the 2 hour trial without having already set your character up in that character customization utility, then you're going to waste a good chunk of the time you have available on just getting your character and the main pawn set up. I had already used the character creation utility to get the main character and the main pawn set up, so I didn't have to worry about that. Thus, I was able to focus on the more meaty elements of the game. Of course, initially the presentation, but also story and gameplay. And much more importantly, for only having 2 hours to mess around with it, the performance. Because that was the biggest complaint pretty much everybody, even die-hard Dragon's Dogma fans, have about Dragon's Dogma 2. That it just has severe performance problems on PC that they apparently still haven't patched out. I say apparently because I ran into them. I have a Ryzen 9 5900X, 64 gigs of RAM, and an RTX 3080. It is complete overkill for my monitor's native resolution of 1080p. And it considerably exceeds the recommended specifications of the game, which are a Ryzen 5 3600X, 16 gigs of RAM, and an RTX 2080, which, according to the notes in their recommended specifications, is apparently enough to get you 30 frames per second at 4K. And to give you some additional points of reference, the minimum specifications are a Ryzen 5 3600, 16 gigs of RAM, and a GTX 1070, and their estimate is that that'll give you 30 frames per second at 1080p. And now that I've had a chance to mess around with the game myself on a system that considerably exceeds the recommended specifications and is rendering at the resolution they target for the minimum spec, I am thoroughly unpleased to tell you that I have absolutely no idea where Capcom is getting those specifications from. because on my system, the game fluctuates wildly in frame rate at all times. And there never seems to be any kind of rhyme or reason for it. I might be wandering through an area and the frame rate will go from 120 all the way down to 30 for no discernible reason, and then back up to the 40s and the 60s and 70s and 80s. It just goes all over the place and is incredibly annoying. It sounds absurd to say this, but if the game ran at 30 frames per second, but it was constantly 30 frames per second, then that would be better than what we currently have, because even though the game can run at 60 frames per second, and obviously it would be way better at 60 frames per second, it's just so inconsistent that it actually affects your ability to play the game. And while on my particular rig it didn't ever become truly unplayable in terms of frame rate, your mileage may vary wildly. If you have worse hardware than mine, then it may very well be completely unplayable at times. And keep in mind that I was messing around with this game after they had patched it a few times, and some of those patches specifically cite that the game should run better. So if this is how the game is performing after it supposedly is running better, then I shudder to think how bad it was on launch. Now, I will be fair and point out that in the patch notes for the patch that they released just prior to making the trial available, they said that they are still working on improving the frame rate, but who knows how long it'll take them to sort out the issues, if they're even able to sort them out at all. For all we know, it might be a fundamental issue with the way the RE engine is coded that doesn't come up in the games like Resident Evil because they're so much smaller and more condensed than a game like Dragon's Dogma 2 is, but is basically insurmountable when you scale it up to the likes of Dragon's Dogma 2. Unfortunately, we just don't know yet, so the only thing we can really do is sit back and wait for them to patch the living crap out of the game and hope that it gets better. But even if they somehow do manage to fix all the performance issues and make it actually run smoothly from start to finish, the question remains whether or not the experience of Dragon's Dogma 2 is worth having after they've patched all that stuff out. And that's where the 2-hour part of the trial ultimately fails, because that's not anywhere near enough time to really get a true feel for the game. Because that's barely enough time to get to the first major settlement of the game, which is the capital of Velmuth. And as such, you're not really going to get a whole lot to do during combat, because the only things you're really going to be fighting are basically just goblins and harpies with a single ogre between you and the city. And funnily enough, that ogre fight is where I experienced the absolute worst performance of my entire time with this trial. I was baffled when I got to the city and it was in the roughly 40s to 50s of frame rate, but during that ogre fight is when it dropped down to about 30, and it stayed there for a while, so I have no idea what the hell was happening there. But anyway, point is that you're only going to get a small tasting of the mechanics of the game by the time you get to the end of those 2 hours, and that means that you're not going to get access to any of the more interesting special abilities, you're not going to get access to any of the more advanced vocations, you're only going to have the very bare bones gear that the game starts you with up until you get to the city, and then you might get something slightly better, but by that point, you're pretty much done with the trial anyway, so you're not going to have a chance to really use it. And since the ogre fights are simple, straightforward, and ultimately quite easy, you're not really going to get a chance to kind of test your mettle against the game's more interesting monsters to fight. So unfortunately, I really don't have a whole lot to talk about in terms of the game's mechanics. They more or less just feel like a continuation of what we saw from Dragon's Dogma Dark Arisen, only with better graphics and slightly better animations, and that's kinda it, really. Obviously, things might change when you get a bit further into the game and you get access to some of those more advanced vocations and better abilities and such, but what I was able to mess around with during this trial all felt very familiar after having played quite a lot of Dragon's Dogma Dark Arisen. So if you liked the mechanics of the previous Dragon's Dogma game, then you'll probably like them in Dragon's Dogma 2, and if you didn't like them in the original Dragon's Dogma, well, unless something significant changes later on in the game when you get access access to more stuff, I doubt the sequel is going to change your mind about them. Similarly to not having enough time to really be able to delve into the mechanics properly to assess them, you also don't really have enough time to really delve into the story or the characters or the quests or anything like that. But what little I was able to experience of the story, characters, and side quests was all quite generic and uninteresting, even down to the main character having amnesia, because it's a Japanese game, of course they have amnesia. I swear, with how often that gets used as a plot device in Japanese media, you'd think that there is an absolute epidemic of amnesia in that country, but no, it's just whatever reason, they seem to absolutely love it as a plot device, but whatever. The writing definitely wasn't the strong suit of the original Dragon's Dogma either, so I'm not massively concerned about it, but I was hoping that they were going to improve things with the sequel, and the general impression I got from not just the writing side of things and the mechanics side of things, but obviously the performance side of things, is that Dragon's Dogma 2, if you just completely ignore the performance problems, is really just more of the same with some slight tweaks here and there, and that doesn't really inspire confidence. And if you want more details about why it doesn't really inspire confidence, I'll go ahead and throw up that link to the video on Dragon's Dogma Dark Arisen, so you can check that out and see what I had to say about that. But as for Dragon's Dogma 2, the first impressions are really not good, and it really doesn't help that they also threw in a bunch of microtransactions for gameplay-affecting items that are basically the same thing Ubisoft has been doing with their so-called time savers that they've been putting into their recent games. And while obviously 2 hours is nowhere near enough time with the game to be able to determine whether or not those microtransactions are especially egregious, even if they are completely superfluous and the game gives you plenty of those things anyway, it's still just a clear attempt at money grubbing, and it is absolutely scum behavior. And I don't care whether you like the game or not, these kinds of microtransactions are indefensible. They are actively making the entire games industry worse. They may not necessarily be as horrendously egregious as the stuff we see in, say, Ubisoft's games, where they put boosters to increase your rate of experience point gain and your rate of currency accumulation by 50% each, meaning that in reality they actually cut your rate of experience point and currency gain in half unless you just pay extra, but it is still scummy behavior, and Capcom deserves every last bit of criticism they get for it, and absolutely nobody should ever support these kinds of microtransactions at all, whether it be actively supporting them by buying said microtransactions, or even just passively supporting them by saying, it's not that big of a deal, you don't actually need to buy these things to progress in the game. No, don't make excuses, definitely don't buy these things, absolutely criticize the hell out of Capcom and any other developer or publisher that does this kind of thing in any game it ever comes up in, because unless we actively oppose these anti-consumer practices, they will continue to further infest the games industry and make everything worse. And that's about all I've got to say about Dragon's Dogma 2 at the moment. Obviously, 2 hours with the game is not enough to get a significant critical assessment. I'm only able to get some first impressions, and as you just heard, those first impressions were pretty rough. And regardless of whether or not you like Dragon's Dogma, in its current state, I really just can't recommend it based purely on the performance issues alone. Obviously, we'll see what happens later on down the line after they've had more time to keep patching the game and if they manage to sort out the performance problems. But let's just say that after the trial I messed around with, I'm really not optimistic for it, and I'm definitely not going to be picking this thing up for anything remotely resembling full price. As such, I simply can't tell you when a more substantial video on Dragon's Dogma 2 might pop up on my channel, because I have absolutely no idea when I'll be able to pick it up. It might be even years down the line before it's on sale for low enough that I might consider picking it up, so it's hard to say. But in the meantime, I've got plenty of backlog to catch up on, so I'm going to go ahead and get back to it. Thank you all very much for watching, and if you like my channel, please consider supporting it on Patreon. If you can't afford to or don't want to, that's fine, I understand, but the option's there if you're interested, and every bit really does help out. You'd be amazed how even $1 a month can really help out. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you all in later videos.